Well, welcome to our discussion of the books of Ruth and Esther in honor of Chag HaShavuot. Of course, today is also Yom Yerushalayim, and I'm broadcasting this class from the holy city of Jerusalem. What you have in front of you is a list of sources which emphasize the commonalities in Hebrew, and we'll go through them as we go through each one of them, pointing out the similarities and differences between the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. Our topic is, why are the books of Ruth and Esther so much alike? Now that topic sounds very strange, as the books seem to have nothing in common besides a female heroine, and the differences between the two are vast. The book of Ruth takes place in rural Judea, in Beit Lechem, in the period of the Judges. The book of Esther takes place in Shushan HaBirah, the capital city of the Persian Empire, in the period of the Persian kings, some 700 years later. In fact, they appear as mirror opposites. In Ruth, a Moabite woman marries a Jew who fathers a king. In Esther, a Jewish woman marries a Gentile who is a king, but are apparently childless. In the version of the Bible adopted by Christianity, they are not connected at all. Ruth appears near the beginning of the historical section, between the book of Judges and Samuel, as appropriate to its background, whereas Esther appears near the end between Nehemiah and Job, according to its historical reality. In the current version of the Bible adopted by Judaism, Esther and Ruth appear together with the other three Megillot. The 5 Megillot, or scrolls, are structured in our Bible according to the lectionary use in the synagogue, starting with the Song of Songs for Pesach, Ruth for Shavuot, Lamentations for Tisha B'Av, Ecclesiastes for Sukkot, and finally, Esther for Purim. On the surface, the books of Ruth and Esther have almost nothing in common. What about below the surface? True, the storylines are different. The techniques, however, for the structuring of the plot are not that different. This means that as narrative, they differ considerably, but as narratology, they converge considerably. Now let me explain. Narrative deals with what is told. Narratology deals with how it is told. The issue is not the storyline, but how the story is told. What is known as emplotment, how the plot works out. That is, the act of constructing a narrative structure or plot by connecting the various elements in a coherent manner. This involves the arrangement of the individual elements into a larger framework to create a sense of purpose within the narrative. Now, how does this apply to finding the commonalities of our two stories? Now, obviously, Ruth and Esther are heroines, but that is not a distinguishing factor. The Tanakh has many heroines who determine the outcome of the story, from Chava to Rivka, from Rachav to Yael, from Devorah to Abigail, and then later Yehudit. So let's investigate the other commonalities of Ruth and Esther, such as their sharing the 3 narrative unities of time, place, and character. Unlike the stories of Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef, Moshe, and Shmuel, which extend over a lifetime, or take place in different countries, or involve a change of characters, the books of Ruth and Esther share a limited time, a single place, and a consistency of characters. First, regarding time, both stories take less than 2 years. Regarding place, both occur primarily in a single city. Beit Lechem for Ruth, Shushan for Esther. Regarding characters, both begin and end with the same characters. Mordecai and Esther for one, Naomi and Ruth for the other. In both Ruth and Esther, God plays a backseat role. God neither speaks, nor directly addressed, nor directly intervenes. Still, the coincidence of events in both creates an aura of God directedness, a director behind the scenes. The absence of an explicit God does not preclude the presence of an implicit God, sometimes understood in terms of hester panim, which is the eclipse or hiddenness of God. The absence of God directedness correlates with other books in the Persian period, such as Ezra and Nehemiah, as opposed to Samuel and Kings of the classical biblical period, where God's presence is highly pronounced. When we focus on the pattern or structure of events, unexpected connections come into view. What are some of these? First, in Ruth, a distressed widow acquires a husband, Boaz, who saves her from her plight. In Esther, a distraught queen acquires a husband, Achashverosh, through whom she saves a people from their plight. In Ruth, a destitute Moabite woman becomes the mother of Jewish kings. In Esther, a Jewish orphan becomes the wife of a Persian king. Ruth ends with an unexpected genealogical succession. From Ruth and Boaz, we get to Obed and David. The book of Esther ends with an unexpected political succession. From Vashti and Haman to Esther and Mordecai. On the one hand, both Ruth and Esther move from outsider to insider, from destitution to actual or potential royalty, from being dependent upon others to having others dependent upon them, such as the reversal of roles of Naomi versus Ruth and Haman versus Esther. On the other hand, in Ruth, a non-Jew marries a Jew. In Esther, a Jew marries a non-Jew. The paths of transition, however, overlapped. So we're going to specify them. We're going to source number one. And source number one on your chart, on the handout, which is now highlighted. In both cases, Esther and Ruth found favor in the eyes of their patron. Both stood out from among the women seeking the attention of their patron. Regarding Esther and Achashverosh, it says, "Vayahav hamelech et Esther mikol hanashim vatisa chen v'chesed lefanav." The king loved Esther more than all the other women, as she won his favor, chen, and grace. Regarding Ruth and Boaz, it says, "Vatomer elav madua matzati chen beinecha lakireni vanochni nochriya." That is, Ruth said to Boaz, "Why have I found favor, chen, in your eyes to acknowledge me, seeing that I'm a foreigner?" In fact, the expression for Ruth for finding favor, matzati chen beinecha, appears twice in Esther, 7:3 and 8:5. We can see more parallels by focusing upon the beginning, the middle as the turning point, and end. Listen to this. Both begin with the loss of a spouse. Achashverosh loses his wife Vashti. Ruth loses her husband Machlon. Coming at the beginning, both losses create an expectation of a turnaround. How will the loss of the spouse be made up? In the book of Esther, Mordecai solves the problem by having Achashverosh marry Esther. In the book of Ruth, Naomi solves the problem by having Boaz marry Ruth. Now let's look at number 2. In number 2, which is now being highlighted, in both cases, the older relative, that is Mordecai and Naomi, mentor the younger relative, Esther and Ruth. Both are called guardians or caretakers. Mordecai is called Esther's Omain, Vayi Omain et Hadassah, chapter 2:7. Naomi, upon taking the child of Ruth, is called Omenet, Vatihi lo Omenet, 4:16. In both cases, the older gives advice to the younger relative on how to reverse the situation. In both cases, the suggestion is accepted by the younger, Ruth and Esther, but revised according to their feminine wiles to turn the tables and achieve their goal. Both Ruth and Esther get the ruling man, Boaz and Achashverosh, to intervene and save them in company. Both achieve their goal by uncovering at the turning point in the story. Esther uncovers Haman's plot to Achashverosh at her party. Ruth uncovers the garment of Boaz at his threshing floor. Now look at point number 3. Point number 3. In both cases, the turning point is at night. Esther says, the book of Esther says, B'maylahu nadada shanat melech. That night, sleep deserted the king. What about the book of Ruth? Ruth evokes the salvific night of the Exodus by using the identical expression of the Exodus, chapter 12:29 of Shemot. Vayi b'chatzi halayla. And what does she say? Ruth 3:8. Vayi b'chatzi halayla, v'yecharar ish, v'yilafet, v'yinei isha shochevet margolotav. In the middle of the night, the man gave a start and jerked back. Behold, a woman lying at his feet. So both use the phrase Laila, Vayi b'chatzi halayla. Now, neither Achashverosh nor Boaz get a good night's sleep. That night in each story constitutes the turning point leading to the resolution of the story. Both stories also have a potential spoiler. Haman in the book of Esther, Tov in the book of Ruth. In both cases, the man in control, Achashverosh and Boaz, resolve the issue by the disposing of the spoiler. Haman and Esther, Tov and Ruth. Even Vashti and Orpah have their parallels. Vashti serves as Esther's foil, as Orpah serves as Ruth's foil. Both Vashti and Orpah do the sensible and the expected, and then vacate the stage. Both Esther and Ruth do the outrageous and unexpected, and move from side to the center of the stage. Now, how do Esther and Ruth pull off their heroic role? What is the common denominator? Both Esther and Ruth follow their mentors' urgings to intervene, but neither intervenes the way their mentor instructed them. With Esther, this is obvious. She refuses to heed Mordecai's reckless advice to barge in on the king and plead the case of her people. Instead, she sets up Haman by inviting him to a private party in her own quarters with her husband, with whom she has not been for over a month. And the fool, Haman, so full of himself, shows up, as if he were invited to a menage a trois. Now let's look at source number 4 and see the common denominator. Naomi also tells Ruth to interrupt Boaz's sleep on the threshing floor and do what he says. She says, "V'hu yagid lach et asher ta'asin." Instead, Ruth turns the tables, leading Boaz to say, "Vata biti, al tir'i, ko asher tomri eseh lach." And now, my young lady, have no fear. whatever you say, I will do for you. Instead of heeding Naomi's advice of doing whatever Boaz says, Ruth gets Boaz to agree to do whatever she says. Naomi assumed that Boaz, the wealthy landowner, would call the shots. Ruth, the destitute foreigner, proved otherwise. Note also the parallel between Boaz and Achashverosh. The former says to Ruth, whatever you say, I will do for you. The latter says to Esther, Ma she'ilatech v'yinatei lach, ma bakashatech od v'teyas. Whatever is your wish, it shall be granted, and whatever is your request, it shall be done. So the word done or do, teyas, is equivalent in both statements. Now let's turn to number 5. Ruth also revises Boaz's own compliment to Ruth about God. What does Boaz say? He says, Asher bat lachasot tachat kenafav, that you sought refuge under his wings, referring to God's protective element. But then she turns to Boaz and she says, Ufarasta kanafecha alamatcha kigoelata, using the exact same words that he used. Spread your wing, which in this case is a garment, over your handmaid, for you are the Redeemer. Ruth thus assumes an active role in bringing about the redemption. In both cases, the heroines, Esther and Ruth, turn the tables on the supposed male, Boaz and Achashverosh, and bring about the denouement, or climatic resolution. Now let's look at number 6. Amazing the comparison here. In both cases, there's also the double intrusion of advising women. In Esther, Zerah speaks twice, at 5:14, before the Haman Mordechai reversal, and after, at chapter 6, verse 13. In Esther, they shift from the positive to the negative. In Ruth, they shift from the negative to the positive. In Esther, the first is positive about Haman's spectacular rise. This is Zeresh. She says along with the others, let a stake be put up 50 cubits high, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. Now watch this. Then you, that is Haman, can go gaily with the king to the feast that Esther has invited you. But then she speaks up again afterwards, and the second is negative about Haman's destined fall. His advisors and his wife Zeresh say to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. So the first is positive, and the second is negative. Now look at Ruth. Also, the local women speak twice. In the beginning, at Naomi's return, and at the end of Obed. The first is negative regarding Naomi's bitterness, and the incongruity of being called Naomi, that is pleasantness. The second is positive regarding the newborn child. Vatomar hanashim el Naomi, Baruch Adonai asher lo ishbit lach goel hayom v'yikarei shmo b'Yisrael. And the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not withheld a redeemer from you today. May his name be perpetuated in Israel. So in both cases, we have women intruding. With regard to the book of Esther, it starts off positive, ends up negative. In the book of Ruth, it's just the opposite. Starts off negative, ends up positive, as if one were the mirror opposite of the other. There's also a commonality of historical perspective. Look at number 7. The book of Esther retrojects 3 generations back to Kish, Mordecai's great-grandfather. It says, Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushana bira, ushmor Mordechai ben Yair, ben Shimi, ben Kish, Ish Yemini. In the capital Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordecai, the son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjamite. The book of Ruth, on the other hand, projects 3 generations forward to David, Boaz's great-grandson, who Boaz holided Oved, Oved holided Yishai, Yishai holided David. Boaz begot Obed, Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. One goes 3 backwards, one goes 3 forward. Again, mirror images of each other. Finally, number 8, Esther and Ruth also share the same Hebrew verb, sin bet resh, for looking forward. For Esther 9:1, it is the false hope of the enemies of the Jews looking forward to dominating them. And of course, it gets reversed, as it says, Sibru oivei hayudim lishlot bahem v'nafachu. For Ruth 1:13, it is the false hope of Ruth and Orpah, looking forward to other children from Naomi. Hangahein tisaberna ara sheigdalu. So these rare verbs, looking forward to sin bet resh, which later on is spelled samech bet resh, again, both appear in the book of Esther and the book of Ruth. In the end, the prominence of the younger hero, Esther and Ruth, yields to the older mentor, Mordecai and Naomi. The plot of the book of Ruth begins and ends with Naomi. She begins as the mother of Ruth's husband and ends as the mother of Ruth's child, almost edging Ruth out. The plot of the book of Esther begins with Mordecai as Esther's uncle and ends with Mordecai as Esther's co-regent, almost edging her out, since the final word underscores Mordecai's Jewish greatness, Godol HaYehudim, not Esther's. What 2 amazing stories of reversals. So different, yet so alike. The great reversals in the book of Esther and Ruth are individual and collective. Individually, Esther, an orphan Jewish girl, becomes the queen of Persia. Collectively, a people on the verge of extermination become politically dominant and religiously attractive. What about Ruth? Ruth, individually, a Moabite, childless, destitute widow, becomes the Jewish spouse of a wealthy landowner. And she becomes the progenitor of David, the future king of Israel. Collectively, in the period of the Judges, are planted the seeds of monarchy. Just as dramatic are the reversals. Haman, who instead of hanging, is hung. Mordecai, who instead of being hung on raised gallows, is raised the viceroy of Persia. Esther, instead of going down with her people, becomes the savior of her people. Naomi and Ruth, instead of childlessness, there is motherhood. Similarly, the land of Israel, instead of famine in verse 1-1, there is the abundance of bread in 1:6. As the land of Israel transitions from famine to abundance, so Ruth transitions from barrenness to fruitfulness. Now I'm going to look at the last one, number 9. There is the common denominator of the reversal from non-Jew to Jew. The case of Ruth 1:16, switching national and religious loyalty. Ruth says, Amech ami, velahayach Elahai. Your people are my people, and your God, my God. This event is paralleled by the book of Esther, chapter 8, verse 17, which documents the conversions, in quotations, to Jewishness throughout the Persian Empire, saying, Rabim mehamei aretz mityahadim. And many of the peoples of the land of Persia profess to be Jews. By now, it is clear that the surface differences should not be allowed to block out the subsurface commonalities. Only under the surface do we discern the roles of Naomi and Mordecai, Boaz and Achashverosh, and above all, Ruth and Esther operating in tandem. Nonetheless, major differences remain. Two of them stand out. The book of Ruth understands redemption to be that of Israel in its land. The book of Esther understands redemption to be that of Israel outside its land. Ruth plants the seeds of the Jewish monarchy. Esther celebrates Jewish integration into the Persian monarchy. Now, this is quite surprising, since chapter 2 underscores that Mordecai descends from a refugee family from Jerusalem. One who would have expected that the climax of the story would have reversed that. But history does not bear that out. On the other hand, the lexeme Gaal, redeem, appears some 20 times in Ruth, but not at all in Esther. Apparently, the real redemption remains Israel-centered. Something we must all take to heart today, which is Yom Yerushalayim. Nonetheless, in both cases, female initiative engineered the redemption, determining the destiny of Israel. And as we say regarding the Exodus, B'zchut nashim tzadkaniyot nigalu miMitzrayim, by virtue of the righteous women, Israel was redeemed from Egypt. So we say regarding both Esther and Ruth, our heroines for Purim and Shavuot, may the merit of righteous women effectuate our redemption. And thus we've presented what we call the commonalities in structure and in plotment between the book of Esther and the book of Ruth. So on the surface, they are two very different books. But from the structure of the emplotment, how things work out in the narrative, on the relations between female and male, on those subject to those who rule, and on the control of a turnout of events by Ruth and by Esther, and the secondary role played by Mordecai and Achashverosh or Haman, show that the dominating role of the woman is not only she's the heroine of the story, but in both cases, they are the engineers of the story, making the plot move forward, bringing it to its final conclusion. In that sense, Ruth and Esther are complementary stories, even though the actual storyline have almost nothing to do with each other. It is clear that from the point of view of narratology and the structures of the story, and the means used to advance the story toward the final denouement, underscore the commonality between the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. And that we conclude our analysis of the two stories, and more than happy to open for questions for any elements that people remain unclear.
Rabbi Kimmelman, if I may push back a little bit on what I heard you say, although I might not have taken it down entirely accurately. You spoke about the Megillah perhaps celebrating Israel's integration into Persian society, as opposed to the Book of Ruth being about Israel's nationhood. I wonder if it's really celebrating that integration, or perhaps highlighting the precarious nature of that integration, albeit with some hope that things might work out and Israel might survive or even thrive in that society, but still also flagging how precarious that situation is.
You sound like you're reflecting the modern American Jewish experience.
Guilty as charged.
Okay, but that is correct, meaning the end of the story ends as a success. But the success is not the Jews returning to the land of Israel, as one could have thought because of the beginning, underscoring that Mordecai is a refugee from Jerusalem, 3 generations removed. Rather, the success is the greatness of Mordecai, of being Mishneh LaMelech, and Esther, and the downfall of Haman. So from that point of view, the end of the story is integration of Jewish life in the Persian Empire and succeeding. It's almost like, if you think you're alluding to present reality, the two visions of Jewish redemption promoted in the 20th century, one being the American model, and one being what? The Israel-centered model. And the realities of the last 2 years underscore your insight of the precarious of that situation. Nonetheless, for generations, it is felt by those who are participated as a quasi-redemption.
I thought of another interesting commonality. Well, and that is in Esther. She goes to Ahasuerus uninvited to plead for her people. By doing that, she could have been killed. So she takes her life in her hands to save her people. In Ruth, I think she lies to the local people about who she is, and she, of course, is takes her life in her own hands, and she's, of course, the mother of David, who saves the Jewish people.
But let's be clear here. Ruth, as far as I know, never hides her origin. She over and over again is called a Moabite, and she's also introduced by the workers in the field to Boaz as such. Esther refuses to disclose her identity until the end. So from that point of view, if that's a positive point, Ruth is clear who she is. Everybody knows who she is. And in fact, Boaz is quite aware of who she is.
Well, wasn't it?
Esther, Achashverosh has no idea who this woman is. In fact, had he known who the woman was, Esther, the story wouldn't work. But in that sense, I think the story is praising Esther. Now, Esther, you say, comes in uninvited. Not exactly, right? I mean, Mordecai wanted to have her barge in and plead for her people. And she was much smarter. If she barged in, it cost her life. What she does is extraordinary. She goes in and invites her husband to a party and invites Haman along with him. Now, if it's true that Achashverosh is not a tippish, he's going to spend all night long thinking, what? Why am I invited to a party by my wife who I have not seen for 30 whole days at least? And suddenly Haman shows up. And then suddenly, as he's thinking about this whole thing, who knocks on the door? Haman. And then he goes to the second party. Who shows up there? Haman again. So Esther's extraordinarily discreet and clever. The way she has structured the situation, allowing for suspicions to arise, allows him to absorb these possibilities. When he comes to the second party, he's ready for the disclosure. I think it's sheer genius on her part. And if had she done what Mordecai did, she wouldn't have succeeded at all. Any other comments or reflections or alternative positions?
Can we
Oh,
get
yes,
a copy?
Arya, yes?
Can you get a copy of your Word document?
Yes, you mean the thing that was a handout?
Yes.
Yes, I think if, Noah, can you answer the question? How can they get a copy of the handout?
Okay, so a couple of things I will put into the chat. A link where you can get it actually as a PDF. And so you can click on that link. We will hopefully post this video on the UTJ website soon, and I'll include availability of that PDF on the video on the UTJ website.
Thank you.
And if I may also, first of all, thank you to the Kaplan JCC for hosting this program, which UTJ is co-sponsoring. We also have 2 more webinars with Rabbi Kimmelman scheduled, hosted by UTJ and co-sponsored by the Kaplan JCC. I put some of that information into the chat here, including registration links. One is this Sunday about Akdamut, the liturgical poem for Shavuot. And then we have one before Tisha B'Av on the book of Eicha, Lamentations. And you have links in the chat as to where you can register for both of those programs.
And hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar on the theme of Akdamut, the special piyut for Shavuot, and its connection with the Yotzer HaMorot, the first blessing of the Shema liturgy.
Thank you, Rabbi Kilman.
Okay, Shalom, Shalom. And Chag Yerushalayim Sameach. And Chag
Thank
Shavuot
you.
Sameach.